This is our rollout of a new digital collection online pertaining to Andrew Jackson. And this is something we've been wanting to do for a long time. We have very rich collections that have to do with Andrew Jackson, who of course is a giant not only in the history of Tennessee, but in the history of the United States. Jackson has a very curious legacy, and one that has shifted and changed over time since he came to national prominence. And it tends to change with each generation according to the political desires and needs of that generation. Just most recently, of course, 2 weeks ago, President Trump was here in Nashville at the Hermitage, laying a wreath on Jackson's grave, and has moved his portrait into the Oval Office and is sort of seeking to appropriate that populist mantle that Jackson has always had. Curious because Jackson, of course, was the founder of the modern Democratic Party. He was the first non-Virginia Tidewater planner or person named Adams to be president of the United States, and was seen as a major shift in bringing the common man, the era of the common man, the age of Jackson. Jackson was born into very poor circumstances, was orphaned at an early age, really was a self-made man in all respects, pulled himself up by his bootstraps to take the nation's highest office eventually and become really an iconic figure. One thing about Jackson is he's never gone out of fashion. He's never become obscure. Everybody knows Andrew Jackson. If they know nothing about American history, they know the guy on the $20 bill, which he may be disappearing from that, or at least moved to the backside. But throughout the 19th century, of course, tens of thousands of American parents named their children Andrew Jackson. He was elevated during the New Deal to a kind of proto-New Dealer, a paragon of legislation designed to benefit the common people of the United States. He was appropriated by the Kennedy administration, LBJ, a person that was very close to President Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., wrote famous biographies of Jackson and coined the term Age of Jackson to refer to that period of the 1820s and 30s when he was a giant on the American scene. And for many years, decades, in this state, the Democratic Party, the state Democratic Party, had its annual event on Jackson Day, on Jackson's birthday. So, you know, he's been used in many different ways by different people. Lately, Jackson has somewhat fallen out of favor with many people because of his mainly seen as chiefly responsible for mistreatment of Native Americans. He was, of course, like many of the early presidents from the South, a slaveholder. And for that and other reasons, presumably, the decision was made to de-emphasize his picture on the $20 bill, and to generally he's become kind of somewhat of a pariah in the view of many people, younger people, I would say, in American history. There was before the Hamilton phenomenon ever started, there was a Broadway play called Bloody, Bloody Jackson, and it was pretty bad history, but it, again, emphasized some of those negative aspects of Jackson's career. So, good and bad, Jackson's always been a lightning rod for many different views and ideologies. The nice thing, I think, about us doing this exhibit, this collection that we've got online now, is that we don't have an axe to grind. We're not really interpreting Jackson as thousands of historians who have written the books over centuries about Jackson have. You can read the books about them, but what we have done is put up original materials created by Jackson and his contemporaries, many in Jackson's own hand, many by his closest supporters, some by people who were bitter enemies of Jackson. But putting this material up allows the public to make their own decisions about Jackson based on actual original sources. So I think that's chiefly the value in what we're doing. We're one of the largest repositories of Jackson material, and we put a really interesting, significant selection of it up online for the world to see and reach its own conclusions about Andrew Jackson. Many different people have worked to make this collection possible. We have a digital work group that has helped us with scanning these items and putting them up into this system that you'll see today, and we'll show you a little bit about how to use that and how to look at this material. But really the heavy lifting on this project has been done by my colleague, Zachary Keith. He's done most of the content selection. You know, the collections here are vast. We've been around for almost 200 years, and before us, the Historical Society was collecting Tennessee history. So the collections here there are three major Jackson collections, two of his own papers that came to us, another large collection of material by a Finnish diplomat, a man named Emil Hurja, who was a collector of Jackson stuff, and it's a huge, valuable collection that's here. In addition to those things, the Historical Society has hundreds of Jackson items that were pulled together even before Jackson was president in the early days based on his early career. Also, his major associates, men like John Coffey, William Carroll, John Overton, all of their papers are here. So there was a lot to draw on. And Zach is a really gifted young historian who has, over the past couple years that I've been working with him, been really instrumental in finding a lot of these things in the collections, which I think the public sort of thinks that we know what's here and we've got a handle on everything, but that really is not the case. I've been here a long time, and many of the things that he's discovered in the collections, both with this Jackson project and also with maps. I think the two of us are two of the biggest map geeks around, and we both work on the State Library and Archives digital map collection, which we've got 400 significant historical maps put up, and we put new ones up every month. But he combs the collections, finds a lot of really important material, valuable material that through one way or another has just become kind of obscure and not exactly lost, but it's not well indexed, and he has a real talent for discovering that material in the collection. So that, and the fact that the information that you'll see about these items, what we call metadata, that contextualizes them, describes them, it goes with the image, as you'll see, is probably the richest of any collection that we've put up so far, and that's largely due to Zach's efforts as well. So before he gets too much of a big head, I'll bring him up here and let him do his part.
So as Dr. Moore mentioned, a lot of the early work was about finding the various documents and going through the various collections that we hold here. And I had help from many different individuals as well. Our archivist, Susan Gordon, and Dr. Tom Cannon, who knew of stuff that was already here that may have been difficult to find, other than knowing that it was here. So it took probably a month and a half to pull everything together, going through everything, reading it to make sure the material in it was relevant or important enough to select over other items. A lot of the material we have, it's on certain subjects, and we may have had 15 or 20 letters on the same subject, some of them from other individuals that may not have been quite as influential, or the topics they discussed maybe not as quite as interesting or in as interesting a fashion. So I'll kind of take you through some of the items in sort of a chronological order of his life. I'm not going to get too far into a biography of him, but I'm going to kind of take you through some of the items that we ended up selecting. Of course, we had other help with people, Myers Brown, other people that know, that have very specific knowledge of some of his actions and some of the people that he interacted with, influenced, and some of the events that surrounded his life. So some of the earliest documents, Jackson didn't move to Nashville until like 1788. So we don't really have too much before then, at least in the collection, the online collection that we put together. So Rachel Donaldson, his wife, was the daughter of John Donaldson, who led the expedition down the Cumberland River and established to Fort Nashboro, and really is seen as the father of Nashville, along with a couple of other individuals. So she came along on this expedition when she was only 12. So she really had kind of a tough life early on. So when she got here, they had lived here for a few years, and she married Captain Lewis Robards, who was seen as an upstanding man. He had land. Ultimately, their marriage kind of fell apart. And when they separated, she assumed that he would obtain a divorce, as was customary at the time. Unfortunately for her and for Andrew Jackson, that didn't happen immediately. So during their separation, Jackson, when he was here as a young attorney, lived with the Donaldsons, her parents. So that's assumed when they met, was when he was boarding with them. Obviously, they fell in love, and they were married in Natchez, Mississippi in 1791. And like I said, she was technically not officially divorced from Lewis Robards. And of course, this followed them for the rest of their lives. He was kind of called out for being a bigamist, and she was disparaged by the public, by people he knew, and he was very sensitive to that fact. They found that Rachel and Lewis Robards were finally able to obtain a divorce in 1794, and right after this is when Jackson and Rachel were officially married in Davidson County. So this document here is their marriage bond. Of course, some of the sureties were Robert Hayes and John Overton, two close friends of Jackson and Rachel, and Andrew Ewing was the court clerk, so he was also a signatory on the document. Obviously, this one's in kind of bad shape, but it is over 200 years old. And this document, obviously, it was in 1794, so it was before the state was even officially established. And it says so on there. That's territory south of the river, Ohio. So like I said, Jackson was a young attorney during this time. And during the Constitutional Convention of Tennessee, he was selected as the first representative, and afterwards selected as a senator. He didn't really like politics from the legislative standpoint, because he didn't like compromise. So he eventually resigned his Senate position and was appointed as judge of the Hamilton District in the Superior Court by John Sevier. So this first document we have up here is his appointment from September 20th, 1798, and he was selected to replace Howell Tatum, who had just resigned. Jackson held this judgeship until 1804, which obviously he ultimately resigned as well. So Hamilton District was one of the 5 Superior Court districts and it was in East Tennessee, based out of Knoxville, was where they held court. And the Superior Court is kind of the forerunner to Tennessee's appellate and Supreme Courts today. And that those didn't officially split until after his judgeship ended in 1804. So he's sometimes considered a Supreme Court judge, but technically he was a judge of the Superior Court of Law and Equity, as it was officially known. So the second document is a document that he signed as judge. We have a collection of court documents from the Hamilton District, but instead of getting into that, this one was somewhat interesting in that it's a land indenture for a tract of land in Knox County, just north of the Clinch River, from Ananias McCoy to Samuel Houston. And it actually is not Sam Houston, and I'm not sure if it's his father. I'm assuming it's his father, but the Houstons liked the name Samuel, and tons of them had the name Sam Houston. But it would have been too early to be the Sam Houston that was governor of Tennessee. I think he'd only been 11 when this document was signed. And the reason I think it is his father is because the Sam Houston was from Rock Ridge County, Virginia, which is where his family is from. So it's probably his father or maybe an uncle. Just basically a contract of land that this guy was selling to Samuel Houston. And like I said, Sevier was governor when he appointed Jackson judge. So it seemed like originally they had a fairly stable relationship with one another. But they, as many of you know, that relationship kind of fell apart. On October 1st, 1803, outside the Knox County Courthouse, the two of them, I guess, got into a scuffle. Supposedly, there's kind of a long history of it. It really is. They fought over the who would be Major General of the Tennessee Militia. And then later Jackson kind of accused Sevier of land fraud. So that will very quickly deteriorate your relationship with somebody, especially during this time period. And people held a very strong sense of honor. So if someone were to kind of try to compromise that, people took it very seriously. Especially Jackson, and Sevier would have as well. So outside of the courthouse, supposedly the two men had words with one another, and Sevier brandished his sword, and Jackson pulled some pistols on him. And I think at least one shot was fired that grazed a bystander. It's just kind of interesting that the two of them, a judge and the governor of Tennessee, would get into such a serious argument. But like I said, their sense of honor was absolute. After this, this was on October the 1st, 1803, the two of them sent a series of letters between one another trying to set up a duel. In the letters, they refer to it as an interview, as dueling was illegal in the state of Tennessee. So Jackson wrote a few letters challenging him. Sevier really agreed to it as long as it wasn't within the state of Tennessee, since it was illegal in Tennessee. And as governor, he would want to uphold the law. Jackson uses very strong words in his letters. He was known for kind of a temper, a hot-headedness. So a couple of the quotes he has in his letters, he calls Sevier a coward and a poltroon. And in this specific letter that I have up here, he accuses Sevier of taking the name of a lady on his polluted lips. And Jackson was roughly 20 years younger than Sevier, just a judge. Sevier was governor of Tennessee and sort of a legend in Tennessee for fighting the Native Americans. So the second letter is Sevier's response, saying that his friend, that would be his second. I think you see that Jackson's letter is to Mr. Rawlings. That would have been Sevier's kind of, I don't know if he was they obviously never dueled, but his second, his friend, they wouldn't really make contact with one another. It was through sort of their friends. So I guess it's sort of a liability issue. But of course that they never followed through on the duel. Tempers eventually cooled, although they'd maintained sort of an icy relationship until Sevier's death in 1815. We do have Jackson obviously, like I said, was hot-headed and had a temper. He had a number of other near duels. When he lived in Jonesboro in the 1780s, a guy, Waitstill Avery, made some disparaging comments towards him during court session, and Jackson didn't take kindly to that. So he challenged him, but they never, fired upon each other. After the Sevier duel, Jackson challenged Charles Dickinson to a duel, and they did meet in Kentucky. And we do have a series of letters between them up. We've had those up for a while now, so I didn't want to include those because those aren't newly scanned documents. But they did fight and fire upon each other. Dickinson fired first. He was a well-known shot, so that was kind of a dangerous ploy by Jackson, but it kind of demonstrated his patience. So Dickinson fired first and hit Jackson in the chest. Jackson took his time with his shot and shot Dickinson in the stomach and killed him. But Jackson carried that lead ball in his chest for the rest of his life. Some say that may have caused premature aging or premature graying of his hair. And of course, he would cough up blood occasionally throughout the rest of his life. So by 1806, Jackson had moved from Hunter's Hill, his old home here in Nashville, to the Hermitage land. It wasn't the Hermitage as we know it today. He still lived in a small cabin with Rachel. But a friend named Aaron Burr came and stayed with him in 1805. And Burr was traveling through the Ohio Valley prior to his trip to New Orleans, where he supposedly met with General James Wilkinson and the Spanish. He was later tried for treason for this foray to try to set up kind of their own colony in the Louisiana Territory. Burr in this letter is leaving his horse and carriage and coachman with Jackson and is asking him if there's anything he needs from New Orleans, because that's where he's going next. This was brought up later. Jackson testified at his trial for treason because of this. And I think those documents are held at the Library of Congress or the National Archives. But it was brought up in his elections. The elections of the time kind of try to dig up dirt just like they do today. So this is from the election of 1828, from John Overton to John Coffey, who were both kind of on Jackson's election campaign. Of course, these were very informal. But Overton is writing to Coffey to really ask him to come to Nashville as soon as he could so they could draft a response to some published attack on Jackson related to the Burr conspiracy. In 1812, a Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, tried to gather allies to rise up against the United States government in kind of the Ohio Valley area. And the Creek tribe in northern Alabama and Mississippi Territory were a few of the southeastern Native Americans that followed suit. So in May of 1812, some of these warring faction of the Creek tribe attacked an isolated cabin near the Duck River of the Manley and Crawley families and killed everybody but Martha Crawley. Of course, the Tennessee government and people of Middle Tennessee were outraged about this and requested that justice be served to the warriors that attacked these families. Some friendly Creeks, friendly to the Tennesseans and the United States government, did arrest and execute the guilty parties, which led to a civil war between the Creeks, the friendly to the United States government, and the warring faction. The warring faction is known as the Red Sticks. Red is kind of seen in Native American culture as the symbol for war, as it is the color of blood. The other peace faction is later referred to as the White Sticks, but that was not a contemporary term. So, like I said, a civil war erupted between the Creeks, and a lot of their, the Red Sticks would attack Tennessee settlements. So the militia was called up by the governor of Tennessee, and Jackson was the general of the militia during the Creek War. And the Creek War was really part of the War of 1812, but it's referred to the Creek War. It's kind of its own campaign, but it is part of the larger War of 1812. So Jackson fought a number of battles during the war, but the largest defeat handed to the Creeks during the campaign was at Horseshoe Bend. Of course, this was basically ended the Creek War because of the number of casualties sustained by the Creeks. It was fought on March 27th, 1814. This map comes from his official report to Governor Wiley Blount following the battle. So these Red Sticks had erected fortifications within this bend of the river, the Tallapoosa River. And Jackson commanded the troops that you see, the dotted lines here at the bottom was kind of the frontal assault on the fortifications, and Jackson was in charge of that. And he sent John Coffee, who commanded not only Tennessee militia, but about 600 Native American allies, both Creek and Cherokee. And they surrounded the bend. You can kind of see the dotted line around the bend to prevent any of them escaping across the river. Of course, this battle was heavily favored the Tennessee militia and the U.S. regulars. And it was kind of seen, at least brought up later on, as a slaughter of these Native Americans. Some of the documents we put up, defend Jackson. Some of them call him out on it. We try not to make any judgments ourselves, as we're just putting up the primary sources. So we just wanted to put those out there. And of course, this record is really important because it's his official report. There's casualty numbers. He mentions different individuals who kind of made a name for themselves, who were killed. And it's just really a great document. So this map is just part of it. It accompanies a written report. And the final document up here is a report of strength of Jackson's division of militia right after the battle. So it kind of shows his three commanders that were just below him, Coffee, Doherty, and Johnson, and their troop numbers, and it's signed by the Adjutant General. Like I said, the Creek War was part of the larger War of 1812, and we have a number of documents relating to the Battle of New Orleans, which is where Jackson was really thrust into national prominence. He became a war hero after this battle for his surprising and complete defeat of the British at the battle. Not many people know of the earlier Battle of New Orleans. The British landed on December 23rd, and Jackson rode out to meet them right where they landed. And this battle, this attack was kind of a risky maneuver, but it ultimately bought them enough time to erect defensive fortifications and allow them to get their cannons in place for the January 8th battle. So this is a map from John Eaton's biography of Jackson from 1817, and it shows the night battle of December 23rd. And we have a number of letters that also discuss it as well, one from John Coffee to his wife. And those are some of the richest documents, are these letters from John Coffee reporting battles to his wife. And the second is just an engraving of the Battle of New Orleans, and Dr. Moore will talk more about the battle itself, its significance, a little later. Some of the other documents we have are letters from people all along the Gulf Coast. James Winchester was another of Jackson's friends and contemporaries, and he was stationed at Mobile, commanded the fort there. A number of letters from him and others talking about a regiment of Black Jamaican troops that were being sent to New Orleans, which is kind of interesting. You don't necessarily think of the British kind of impressing their Caribbean colonies for troops, but it definitely did happen. And another one, maybe one of the earliest reports, is from a doctor that's stationed in Pensacola, an army surgeon that announced that the British were massing a fleet right outside of Pensacola, and they were going to be launching an attack on New Orleans. And the reason he had this information is because he had just spoken to a prisoner of war that they had just released who had been stationed on a ship for like 5 months. So that was really important information to have ahead of time, knowing that they were going to go to New Orleans. And another one of the interesting documents we chose for this collection is a broadside call to arms. William Carroll, once Jackson had defeated the Creek at Horseshoe Bend, he was given a commission in the United States Army and was given command of the 7th Military District, which included Louisiana and the Mississippi Territory. So he was a major general in the United States Army, no longer of the Tennessee Militia. So William Carroll was given command of the Tennessee Militia, and he was tasked with going to Nashville. And there's this broadside, which they would have published in the newspaper, calling for 5,000 troops in November of 1814 to go fight at the Battle of New Orleans. And that was one of the items that Dr. Moore was talking about that it was in this very strange collection, kind of set off by itself. It didn't have a finding aid that really we just happened upon because in our barcoding project, it didn't have a finding aid, so we didn't really necessarily know where it came from or how many items were in it. And it was just one of the items that were in there. But it's a really neat piece. So after the war, obviously I said Jackson became kind of a national hero, a military hero. The biggest of the war, he came out looking the best and was really one of the main military heroes of the United States since the Revolutionary War. And so after the war, he went back to Middle Tennessee, and under the Department of War was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was kind of tasked, since he had a history with these American Indians, with being a commissioner for various treaties. And he was really respected by the Native Americans, which, another thing we were talking about, he gets a bad rap for his treatment of the Native Americans, but a lot of them really respected his stature. So this first letter is from the Cherokee Agency, which is near present-day Calhoun, Tennessee. It was there. Calhoun grew around it. So it's from the Cherokee Treaty of 1817. He's writing to Coffee, talking about the treaty negotiations. That was one of the ones he was involved with, and probably the most well-known is the second document. He and Isaac Shelby were the commissioners for the Chickasaw Treaty of 1818, which the Chickasaw Treaty ceded basically all of West Tennessee to the United States government, and later Tennessee received the land. So Shelby and Jackson are writing to Calhoun, who's Secretary of War at the time, and therefore their boss, basically telling them that the treaty was official. This letter was written just 11 days after the treaty was signed. Another point, obviously Jackson owned the Hermitage. The building as we know it today was constructed in the 1820s, right after this treaty making. So Jackson really benefited from his position as a treaty negotiator. He and his friends were able to get some of the best land that came out of the treaties. And he was accused of fraud in these, and it's hard to distinguish whether or not this was fraud or he was just taking advantage of the position he was given. He wasn't the only one that did this. Everyone kind of in that situation was able to, as land was the most important asset you could really have on the southern frontier. So like I said, in the 1820s, he was able to construct the Hermitage after he basically established his wealth after all these land transactions. So this item on the left is a hand-colored lithograph of the Hermitage shortly after Jackson's death, just a couple years. You can see his tomb here to the right, and kind of a weeping willow stands over it. The willow is seen as a sign of mourning. And you can kind of see it's depicted as rolling hills, lush greenery, and it even has a few livestock in the front yard. It was a working plantation. He owned over 1,000 acres. He owned over 150 slaves at its peak, which would have put him really in the top echelon of slaveholders in Middle Tennessee. And we have a number of letters of him selling slaves, or discussing if a couple of them had died. There's some of his overseer possibly mistreating some of his slaves, and concern with that. This letter on the right is to Andrew Jackson Hutchings, who was a ward of the Jacksons. He was, I believe, a cousin or a nephew, and like Dr. Moore said, just another person that was named after him. He was born in like 1812, I believe, and his parents passed away when he was very young, like 5 years old. So the Jacksons took him in and raised him alongside their adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr. So this letter is kind of giving advice on running a plantation and choosing a wife, giving his wife as an example, who had passed away about 5 years prior. Like I said, another one of the kind of the lesser known aspects of Jackson, although a new book has come out recently, kind of talking about his land speculation. So this item on the left is a plat of the John Rice tract. John Rice was a land speculator, and he purchased this 5,000 acres on the 4th Chickasaw Bluff, which is where present-day Memphis is. Back in like 1794, so even before Tennessee had any really legal right to the land. As you can see, John Overton, James Winchester, and Andrew Jackson are some of the landholders. And this far left section is land that they gave up as public land to create the city of Memphis. And that wasn't really just a philanthropic gift. If Memphis became a bustling city, that would have increased the property value of their land. So these three are seen as the founders of Memphis. There are various streets and so forth named after them in the city. The letter on the right is from Jackson to William Williams. That's quite a name. And it's discussing some accusations of him as partaking in land fraud while he was military governor of Florida. So Jackson kind of defends himself of John Williams' claims that he did participate in land fraud, and he also kind of talks about his role as the commissioner of the Chickasaw Treaty that we talked about earlier. So like I said, a new book has just come out recently about Jackson's kind of land speculation as treaty commissioner. Steve Ince keeps Jackson land, which I have not read yet, but I've heard good things. Next up is the election of 1824. Jackson was one of the four candidates for president in the 1824 election, along with William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. William Crawford actually sustained a stroke in the middle of the campaign, so his candidacy kind of fell off other than his home state. And the two really main contenders ended up being Adams and Jackson. And Henry Clay from Kentucky ultimately threw his support behind Adams and was later appointed Secretary of State. Jackson did not like that one bit. He and his supporters really kind of deemed this a corrupt bargain. That was the term given to it. So he was basically accusing Clay of selling out his candidacy for the position of Secretary of State. The letter on the left here is a letter from James Buchanan, who later became president. He was, at the time, a representative from Pennsylvania, to one of his friends, Hugh Hamilton, who was the editor of the Harrisburg Chronicle in Pennsylvania. He's kind of discussing Jackson's candidacy and kind of his character. It's interesting because he specifically calls him a mild, frank, and polished individual, which really goes against kind of a lot of everything else people know and you understand about Jackson. The letter on the right is from Amos Kendall to Jackson. Amos Kendall was also a newspaper editor in Kentucky, and he later became one of Jackson's kind of closest followers. He was part of his kitchen cabinet. Jackson appointed him to a treasury auditor. He gave him a position in the treasury. He later appointed him as U.S. Postmaster General. And of course, Kendall is discussing the corrupt bargain and is saying that he was instructed to throw his support behind Adams during the time. But this document kind of has to be taken with a grain of salt because Kendall was obviously trying to get in Jackson's good graces. This is just prior to the election of 1828 and when the letter was written, but it was discussing the election of 1824. So Jackson did ultimately lose the election of 1824 to John Quincy Adams, but came back much stronger in the election of 1828. Like I said, these kind of elections were very contentious and used a lot of personal attacks, no different from today. The item on the left shows the electors, and it's kind of a campaign broadside. These are the electors of the state of Pennsylvania for that election. You know, it kind of shows Jackson with militaria around him, propping him up as a war hero, and uses a few of his campaign slogans. The middle item and the far right item are character attacks on Jackson. The middle one, it's kind of hard to read because it's a little small. This document is very large, and I was only able to fit a small reproduction of it here in the slideshow. But it's called An Account of Some of the Bloody Deeds of General Jackson, and goes through a number of attacks on him from his time as militia commander when he executed mutinous troops, to his duels, to his kind of contentious relationship with Thomas Hart Benton and his brother, which I think Dr. Moore will talk about a little later. And the final document is talking about the execution of John Woods, who was one of those 6 militia. And they're really building John Woods up as this innocent child who Jackson they were calling him out as like a tyrannical military leader. So just one of the many attacks on Jackson. We have a number of examples within the collection. So Jackson did win the election of 1828 with like a 56% of the vote. And while he was president, one of the earliest kind of roadblocks he faced was the Nullification Crisis. It really came down to South Carolina, John Calhoun, states' rights. They were kind of the earliest proponents of the states having certain rights to nullify federal legislation or actions, and they really threatened to secede at one point. So it was over tariffs and the passage of the Tariff of 1828, which the South Carolinians called the Tariff of Abominations. They thought that it was to help the northern manufacturers, and it really hurt the southern agricultural economy. So they tried to nullify the bill, which Jackson was actually, the tariff was passed still early on, and Jackson as a southerner was kind of seen as a person who would come in and protect the southerners' rights and their economy, and someone who wouldn't back these tariffs. Unfortunately, Jackson refused to lower the tariff because he wanted to repay the national debt. So Calhoun and he basically became and remained bitter enemies for a very long time, if not through the rest of his life. So this letter on the left is a letter from Wiley Blount, who was formerly the governor of Tennessee. He wasn't at this point, and he's kind of decrying these nullifiers, saying they have empty declarations, and he actually makes the comment and prediction that the nullifiers of South Carolina will never again run as near the brink of their destruction as they did, which is incorrect foreshadowing almost. And then he discusses after the tariff and South Carolina's threat, like basically raised a militia and threatened to secede. Jackson had his supporters pass through the force bill through Congress, which gave him the ability to use military force to put down any sort of rebellion action by the South Carolinians. They eventually came to a compromise and passed the compromise tariff of 1833, which eased tensions and really calmed the threat of secession and their apprehensions with the tariff system. Another one of Jackson's big contentions while president was his war against the U.S. Bank. On the right, we have a political cartoon kind of depicting this economic wasteland because of Jackson's monetary and economic policy. It shows this cart pulled by two oxen who have the face of humans. One of them is Amos Kendall, who I mentioned before, and the other one is Roger Taney, who would eventually become a Supreme Court justice, but he also was in the Treasury Department under Jackson during the time. So it's one of the, and it has kind of an obvious typo in a misprint in the title. So it just goes to show that is a common theme throughout history as well. The item on the left is really one of both Dr. Moore and I's favorite of the collection. It's another political cartoon showing Jackson as like kind of a despotic tyrant. They were projecting him as a kind of a monarch, standing on the Constitution and throwing the Treasury. He's got a scepter in his hand that says veto on it, referring to his veto of the bank's recharter. So Jackson really saw this U.S. bank as enriching the already kind of aristocratic class, and wanted to get rid of it because of that. And its president, Nicholas Biddle, really came to a head during this time. Jackson did successfully veto the bank's recharter, and their charter officially expired in 1836. He passed a number of other monetary policies. I'll let Dr. Moore get more into that. So it's kind of seen as really a victory for him, but it would have other consequences. So after Jackson's presidency, he went back to live at the Hermitage. Obviously, he was alone. Rachel had passed away right before he took the office of president in 1828. A lot of people kind of think that the harsh personal attacks on her really took a toll. She was kind of a sickly person throughout her life anyway. This item on the left is a stereograph of one of Matthew Brady's daguerreotypes that he took. He traveled down to the Hermitage in 1845, the year of Jackson's death, and took a series of daguerreotypes at the Hermitage. Jackson didn't like how he looked in these. He made a few public statements regarding that. So Matthew Brady really is known for his Civil War images, but he had just kind of set out on his own when these were taken. I think this is the first president that he was able to capture on film. And the final document is an invitation to his funeral. TSLA has a number of these, and I actually came across one of the items we have. TSLA back in the late 1800s exchanged an item with the National Archives, because we had multiple copies. We still have multiple copies of this funeral invitation for one of the other broadsides. So they had multiple copies of that. We had multiple copies of this, and we had a kind of an exchange of documents, which I didn't necessarily know went on, but it was interesting. So that this just shows it announces his death. It says that his funeral will be at the Hermitage. And these are some of the collections that Dr. Moore talked about a few of them that we used. A lot of them are very rich. Some of them are just more tangential. They talk about his close friends, but a lot of them do have his personal correspondence in them. So obviously the Andrew Jackson collection was a major one. Dr. Moore talked about this Emil Hurria collection, who was a Jackson collector and Swedish diplomat. The Dias collection of John Coffey papers is a really massive collection, and John Coffey was one of Jackson's closest friends. So that has a number of Jackson-related items in it too. And the other ones kind of just have certain items related to Jackson, but we just kind of wanted to get those out there in case you wanted to search them further for other items that we didn't necessarily include in this exhibit. Here's our contact information. I also kind of wanted to highlight this book comes from the Dias collection of John Coffey papers. It's a ration book. of his volunteer cavalry from 1813 in the Creek War, War of 1812. But at the back, I mean, the ration book itself is fascinating, and it shows kind of the rations the soldiers needed to eat in each division, how much they went through per day. But at the back, there was this kind of this cotton schedule. It's like it shows a number of slaves. It names them. It shows how much cotton they picked per day from September to December 1822 and 1823, but it doesn't really say for whose plantation it was, whose slaves they were. But the ration book was John Coffey's. It was in John Coffey's handwriting. So my first assumption was that it was John Coffey's plantation. And I did a little further digging in the collection, was able to find some slave bills of sale where he had purchased a few of these. It names a few of them. Specifically, the very last name on the list is an individual named Moses. And you see his entry doesn't have anything until the 22nd of September. And according to those bills of sale, he wasn't purchased until September the 10th. So that really led me to believe that this was Coffey's and probably his plantation at Hickory Hill there in northern Alabama. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore to talk a little more about some of the other items and take you through how to use the website.
So we thought we would look at the actual online collection, kind of orient you all to it and how to use it. This is the landing page for it, and if there's a little bit of information there describing it, and then the main portal or entry point for it will be up there where it says Browse Collection. And as you go into it, then it brings up all the objects, and you can look at them in order. If something catches your eye or you're interested in a particular thing, you've got a search box up there that you can, if you're interested in, say, his dueling letters, you can put in Duel, and it'll bring up all those items where that word occurs in the metadata. So we were just going to look at a handful of these things. And also, Zach, let's show them how, well, maybe with the first item, you can, if you pull it up, all right, it brings up the image of the item, and then below it is what I've been referring to as metadata. It's all this contextual information that we've put in there to sort of, describe it, what it is, and its significance, its date, who created it, all of that stuff that catalogers love. And it allows these things to go into WorldCat and be discovered by people, in Europe who are interested in Jackson. Anybody can find this stuff on the web because of this metadata. But if you want to look at the item itself in more detail, you probably want to go to the full browser there, that first icon. If you click that, then it brings up the item, enlarged. You've got a zoom bar up there where you can really, zero in on it, which is helpful for handwriting. This one is TypeScript, but you can really go in, particularly with images and maps, and look at them in great detail, even better than looking at the original. So I thought we'd start with the earliest item in the collection, which is the Distillery Book, what we call the Distillery Book. The first federal tax in America was an excise on whiskey. And there were a few other things that it covered too. There was a direct federal tax on panes of glass. We have a couple examples of that in the collection here. Odd thing, but kind of a luxury item at the time. But this Distillery Book is quite significant. It covers the entire state of Tennessee from 1796 to 1801. And the tax collector of this federal tax for Tennessee was John Overton. And so it's in a collection of an Overton descendant. What's great about it, and I know we have some genealogists in the group today, This thing contains hundreds, thousands of names. Whiskey distilling is not a furtive activity of moonshiners in the 1790s and 1800s. It's what ordinary farmers do with their corn. Corn being perishable, you either feed it to hogs and salt your pork and keep it that way, or you make whiskey out of it, which has value, can be exported, it keeps indefinitely, you can ship it down to New Orleans and sell it. There are a lot of people in this book, and we've scanned the entire thing. The whole book is up. If you click on that link, now the pages in the collection are ones connected with Jackson. It's pages that he shows up on. But you can see from this, it's a very carefully kept record book. It's organized by year and then by county. So if you have an ancestor who was farming in Tennessee in these years, in the early years of statehood, it's an easy matter to go to that county, check the list of names, and see who's being taxed for whiskey distilling. And Overton is a careful scrivener. He's got a good hand. It's clearly legible. The categories at top are, the date, the name of the individual, the number of pots or stills that he has, the amount of whiskey he's producing in gallons, and the tax that he's paying. So all of which is to say that this book is up in its entirety, and it's a valuable genealogical as well as historical resource. Just as an aside, the architect of this first direct tax at the federal level is, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who's much in vogue these days because of the Broadway play. A lot of Jackson's fiscal policies are really formulated in opposition to that Hamiltonian program, which the reason Hamilton gets Washington to support this tax and passes it is to provide some revenue, because he has assumed all the debts of the state from the Revolutionary War. He's created a federal debt because, how do you tie the states and individuals to the federal government? Well, you create bonds, so people can acquire bonded debt, and then the federal government is responsible for paying that debt. He creates a national bank. He is the architect of our modern fiscal system in the United States, and Jackson didn't really like all of that. Jackson was of that generation, a little bit younger, but he grew up in the Revolutionary War, and his war on the bank later during his presidency, and all of his fiscal policies are very much in that Jeffersonian vein of being suspicious of banks, not liking paper money, wanting hard currency, et cetera, et cetera. And they're fairly complex, but a lot of it comes down to an anti-Hamilton policy. You can see here, as an early planner, this is before he has the Hermitage. He's at Hunter's Hill in these years. He's being taxed on his whiskey production. So a lot of Pennsylvania farmers actually went up in arms over this tax. They opposed it and refused to pay it. And Hamilton got on his horse and led the army into Pennsylvania to force compliance with this early federal tax. The next item comes from the Creek War, which Zach talked about a little bit. And again, we've put the entire book up there. There's about 130 pages to this. It is the quartermaster's accounts of monies paid for various services rendered to the state of Tennessee during the Creek War. And this is for all manner of services. The entire thing, as I said, is up here as what we call a compound object. You can scroll through all of those pages, and it again has hundreds, if not thousands, of names of individuals who are being paid for some service or resource provided to keep the army going during the Creek War. It gives you a tremendous insight into the logistics of supplying an army and keeping thousands of men in the field fighting for months and months. It extends from 1813 through 1815, and all manner of individuals here being paid for livestock, for forage, for wagons. There are many women in here who are being paid for sewing, for boarding sick soldiers, feeding them. There are Native Americans in here. Let me see, which page have we?
Elizabeth Logan.
Yes, Elizabeth Logan there. You can see board, washing, and belonging. I'm not sure.
Can you search by name?
Not yet, but if we can index these names in here, then that will be possible. But right now it's just by date where it's dispersed. But you can see this woman, Elizabeth Morgan, 45 days attending to sick soldiers and keeping them at her lodging. So we also featured a couple pages in here that have Native Americans on there where they're being paid for being runners for the Army, couriers, being scouts, translators. So again, as Zach mentioned earlier, you have a lot of Native Americans who are fighting with Jackson against other members of their own tribal nation who are part of the war party. So I think Levi Colbert there is a headman in the Creek Nation. He runs a ferry, an important ferry crossing of the Tennessee River that Jackson's troops used when going south into Creek country. So he's an important individual who is part of the pro-American Creek faction. But again, the whole thing's up there. Eventually, perhaps with the help of some volunteers, we will index this and provide a searchable guide to all the people who show up in here. The next item relates to the Battle of New Orleans. This is a very accurate and detailed rendering of the battle by a French engineer named Hyacinthe Leclat, who was there, and this is done shortly after the battle. I want to just say the Battle of New Orleans is an extraordinary event in American history, and Jackson bears a lot of the credit for it, and it absolutely is what catapulted him to his political career and the highest office in the land. And it's extraordinary because the British outnumbered the American forces. These were crack troops straight from the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. They had served in the Peninsular War. They were commanded by the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law, Edward Pakenham. Pakenham was well regarded as a general. He had a superior force of battle-tested veterans, the finest. I don't think there's any question they were the finest infantry, with a possible exception of Napoleon's own armies, in the world. British troops had consistently trounced the Americans in the War of 1812. I don't think there's a single major land battle that the Americans had won at this point. So here you get this invasion force supported by the British Navy, lands on the Gulf Coast. Pakenham brings his troops to threaten New Orleans. And what's Jackson got? He's got a couple of regiments of U.S. regulars, which, as I said, had been consistently beaten by the British in the War of 1812. He's got a couple thousand Tennessee and Kentucky militia. These guys are just regular farmers who are under arms as militiamen that come down on flatboats with William Carroll to fight at New Orleans. He's got Native Americans, he's got Choctaws, he's got free black units from New Orleans under arms. He's got pirates. They're Baratarian pirates with Jean Lafitte. If you've seen the movie The Buccaneer, that was our image of the Battle of New Orleans, Yul Brynner playing Jean Lafitte. But these Baratarians, of course, were able sailors, and they manned the naval guns that Jackson put on his line, which you can see here represented in this drawing. As Zach said, that night battle on December 23rd allowed the Americans to build a well-fortified earthwork embankment line to get behind to face the British attack. A lot of it was cotton bales, which are good absorbers of artillery. And you can see the action here. Right in here is on the far right of the American line. There was a redoubt out in advance with, again, naval guns there. The British attacked that. They took it. The Americans counterattacked and retook that redoubt. There's a lot of action there next to the Mississippi River. This is the Rodriguez House, which Jackson used as a headquarters until the British shelled it. Jackson himself is, Zach's going to zoom in on it for me. He is right in here with the cape. That's Andrew Jackson. The Tennessee militia are in the center and on the far left of the American lines next to a cypress swamp. And here you see the aftermath of the British assault on the middle of the American lines. Disastrous for them. They got kind of mixed up. Some of them came in at an angle, got confused. They didn't have the proper ladders and fascines for scaling the ditch that was in front of the lines. They got pummeled by American artillery. And this right here depicts probably Pakenham, who was mortally wounded and died, being carried off on a stretcher. The two English generals were killed in the action. The English lost hundreds of killed and wounded. Jackson lost 8 soldiers. And we even have in the collection up here a order of battle from Pakenham in his hand, signed by him, that probably was picked up off a dead officer, somehow made it back to Tennessee and was in the legislative papers. So that's but just an extraordinary victory over again, very lopsided victory for Jackson. And even though, in fact, the battle had been fought after the treaty had been signed in Belgium at Ghent, news did not reach the United States till weeks later. And this is a military victory that not only validates Jackson, but it validates the young republic. The United States finally beats the British and triumphs over our traditional foe, and kind of seals the deal as far as the United States being a nascent world power. So this victory becomes the stuff of legend. We've got lots of sheet music in the collection that comes out of that, all the engravings and drawings, and Jackson suddenly becomes a figure of national prominence, and it launches his political career outside of Tennessee. He's already well known in Tennessee, but this battle catapults him to the national stage, which draws, as Zach mentioned, the unfavorable attention. The whole style of modern political campaigns kind of begins with Jackson and his campaigns in the 1820s. He himself does not engage in the back and forth, but his supporters, men like Overton and Coffee and Carroll and Kendall, all of those guys, his handlers, they're the ones who have to parry each attack against Jackson and respond to it in the press. And this is a piece by a longtime enemy of Jackson, Jesse Benton. He and his brother Thomas Hart Benton were Nashvillians, but they clashed with Jackson, and I can't even remember exactly what the catalyst for their feud was, but that's right. Jesse Benton had fought a duel with William Carroll, who was one of Jackson's buddies, and there'd been some back and forth. They had called each other out, and they ended up, Jackson made sure that his friend John Coffey was with him, who was about 6'5" and 250 pounds. He was a big guy. And they ran into the Bentons right down here across from the courthouse where the Adolph Birch building is. They met, Nashville Inn, gunfight. Jackson is shot by Jesse Benton in the shoulder. That ball comes out. He keeps the one from the Dickinson duel, but it lays him up for several months until he gets the call to go south with the Creek War. So this is a mortal enemy of Jackson who's writing this circular from Nashville, mainly talking about how Jackson is he's calling him a murderer, basically, for executing the militiamen in the Creek War. So very, ad hominem, personal attacks, very kind of vicious campaigning, and that sets the tone for American politics. But the one thing that Jackson would not abide, of course, are those attacks on Rachel, and that's what got him in a lot of these duels and fights of his career. So there's that one. I think Zach had shown you the King Jackson circular, which is, he was dubbed an autocrat by enemies, and his style of presidential administration was considered, highly dictatorial. He's trampling on rights here. He's another would-be monarch. And this very sarcastic circular about, born to rule and all of that comes out. And again, a lot of it is the result of these fiscal policies that are seen as not just wrong, but very tyrannical and trampling on popular rights, even though Jackson himself thought he was doing the opposite. So just a couple of examples of a new paradigm of electoral campaign that's very sophisticated for its time. It's fought in the printed medium, newspapers, these kind of broadsides, and the political cartoon comes to the forefront in this period. This is one I like because, I like Old Testament stories. And does anybody know the story of Balaam and his ass? It's from Numbers, chapter 25, and actually all of those text boxes up there, the balloons, they're all literal from the King James, which people of the time knew the King James Bible, and that's why, this is not kind of obscure. They would know that story. It's an amazing story. Lord commands Balaam not to go to the Moabites and consort with Israel's enemies. Balaam disregards that and sets out on his donkey to do just that, and the angel of God appears, which the donkey can see, but Balaam can't. And of course, the donkey's, he's holding a sword. The donkey veers off, and Balaam hits it with his cane, just like Jackson's doing, and does this 3 times. And being the Old Testament, things happen. The donkey turns and says to him, "Why do you strike me? I've been with you since you were a kid." And Balaam goes, "I'd kill you if I could. You keep veering off when I'm trying to go that way." And then the angel reveals himself to Balaam. He sees it, but it puts all of that Old Testament story in the context of these monetary policies that Jackson was forcing through. You can see references on the bag to the specie currency, the bank in the background. Martin Van Buren, his successors trailing behind him. People understood all of those economic issues. I mean, the American electorate is very sophisticated about economic monetary policy in these days and very engaged. You had voter participation rates in the 1830s that were north of 90%. Everybody who could vote, which are white males at the time, did vote. Very different from today, where voter participation rates are down in the 20 and 30% of qualified or eligible voters. So this is just one of dozens of these political cartoons, which are really rich, funny, many of them in our collection. We put a few of them up here. The Indian issue, of course, is what Jackson is primarily pilloried over today. He's seen as he's really the whipping post for mistreatment, unfair treatment of Native Americans. But as Zach pointed out, in his day, he was regarded by Native Americans as a very forthright, honest negotiator. They sought to deal with him because they trusted him. And this is a letter from Jackson, I think. And he says here, he's talking there, the chiefs and the delegation from the Cherokee expressed great anxiety for an exchange of territory. And I have no doubt will be, I'm not sure of that word, by all the natives that support it, or by all the natives of this country, if not overcome by a few white men and half-breeds who have and are still fattening on the annuities of the nation and the labor of the poor Indian. So, I mean, Jackson here is taking a position against those whites who are exploiting the tribes for their land and annuities, the monies that the government was paying them. Just one example, we've got another letter in here where he's talking about how the state of Georgia is going after the Cherokee, and he says this exchange of territory, the necessity of their, not sure of that word, this course being removal, the thing that Jackson is blamed for, removing the Indians, this course as the only means we have of protecting them from the state of Georgia, having extended their civil jurisdiction over them, makes it desirable that the Indians should remove to a territory over which no state has any right to the soil. Jackson saw himself as protecting the Indians by getting them out of the way of these rapacious Georgians who were stealing their land, putting them in jail, mistreating them in their own homeland, mainly in North Georgia, a little bit in Tennessee. But you see, people from Thomas Jefferson forward, Jefferson was very much of this mind too, that the only way to really protect the Indians from all this exploitation by white settlers was to get them out of the way. It was seen in their own eyes as a humane policy for dealing with Native Americans, because you couldn't protect them on the ground from white settlement. Was kind of an inexorable tide that was just moving into their lands, and the Georgians wanted that territory, and gold had been discovered, among other things, in North Georgia. So that really started the land rush. And so Jackson and people around him, it's not just Jackson, it's a very prevalent view, and was considered the progressive view toward Native Americans. That's the point that some of these things kind of suggest to you. When you read their own words about what's going on, it's not quite the black and white issue that it appears today. And finally, I think Zach had shown you the nullification proclamation of Jackson's. You can see it's pretty dense stuff, and this discussion of tariffs and how it works and who it affects and all of that is again complicated economic policy that is right back at the forefront of American economic policy making today. This is what we're talking about with NAFTA, and all of that is the same, the same sort of issue in different terms. But the point I wanted to make here is that Jackson is a Southerner, but he's a Unionist. He confronts Calhoun and the South Carolinians on this issue. Jackson is part of that Revolutionary War generation, and he's not about to allow Calhoun and South Carolina to pull out of the Union. To him, the Union is sacrosanct, and he says that in his famous toast, to the Union may it always be preserved, in response to Calhoun's toast at the White House. And, Jackson has that legacy as a Southern Unionist, and as it turns out, he's kind of on the wrong side of history, because in 25, 30 years from here, there won't be any of those people left much in the South, and secession becomes a reality and the Civil War ensues. But it first arises in Jackson's presidency, and he puts himself quite solidly to the point of threatening to use federal troops to go in to prevent any kind of nullification of federal laws or even secession from the Union. So really an extraordinary figure, still very much being debated about, but never forgotten, as Andrew Jackson. So we hope you will use this new collection, and there's a lot of other neat things in our Tennessee Virtual Archives, a great map collection if anybody is as interested in maps as Zach and I are. But thank you for coming out today, and hope you enjoy the collection.